for me, this perhaps is one of the most important conversations we should be having as a country. And hopefully that will illuminate itself out. And so actually, some of you have been here with me before. You know I don't usually do this, but I'm going to ask you a question. When I tell you, or you tell me, that we live in a democracy, what does that mean to you? Or do you, to the people that you know, when people say something about our democracy, what does that mean? Anybody? Quickly. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
It seems to me that we have a say in our government.
We have a say in the government. Somebody else. What do you think it means to you? Governed by the people.
Like freedoms. Like freedoms. When I think of democracy, I think of like freedoms.
I have freedoms. But I can have freedom under a lot of systems. So then specific something about democracy, we typically laud that idea that our freedoms are somehow better. I'm sure Mr. Putin would tell us that there are a lot of freedoms for people in Russia, and if you were there, you might agree, but you and I being here would probably say, I don't think so. That's obviously in the eye of the beholder, right? So, anybody else want to tell me what you think of? Yes, ma'am?
I would think it's majority rules, but that's not true in our country.
But wait, so the first part, I think that's precisely what most people would say. You live in a democracy, what does that mean? It means majority rules. So, because of your second part, which shows you don't even need to be here because you already get it, we have a problem, right? And the idea that we have a problem, for me, first really popped up in the 2000 election, which most of you, I'm sure, certainly remember. And then you began hearing a phrase, which, by the way, if you're concerned about some of the consternation and churn that we're having as we head into this election, that churn did not begin 4 years ago or 6 years ago or 8 years ago. It began at least 24 years ago when the president was accused of being selected, not elected. Remember that? And whether you liked President Bush or not like President Bush, that phraseology suggested an illegitimate election, which was connected to what? Aren't we in a democracy where the majority rules? And there's all that stuff that happened with the Supreme Court. And of course, it was very big in our state because our Supreme Court, our local or state Supreme Court. You guys all remember all that. But if we don't actually live in a democracy, we don't have the churn. We might have a different churn. So I've presented here before, and maybe need to bring it back again. What do these words mean? We are not going to get into that today because, in one sense, I am the one tilting at windmills with Don Quixote. I am the one who has this elusive dream, and I hopefully will say it to the day I die, that I'm going to continue to pound it into my students, that at least some citizens walk out going, oh, I will never again say anything about our capital D democracy because that does not exist. Which then should lead me as a citizen to say, wait, what do we have, and then what does that mean? By the way, none of that means you can't decide, I want to live in a democracy, and we happen to be alive in the first time in human history where a nation our size could live in a democracy. We have the technology. We could do it tomorrow. You just have to lead a constitutional convention to write a new constitution. And I mean that in all seriousness. So begin the process of you deciding, I want to live in a democracy, and so then lead us down that road. But that conversation is not our point today. Our point today, what I'm curious about, and believe that here's the answer, that is worth our time, is to say, well, how did we get to this point? You know, now I couldn't do it, but if I'd ask you on the way in, or if I ask everybody else in the library, or if I ask everybody walking down Park Avenue here in Winter Park, what's our country's government? 90, 95, 98, 100% of the respondents would say a democracy. And you cannot turn on the news on any of the various channels and their various flavors. You cannot talk or listen to any politician from state, local. Some of you know I ran for office back in 2019, 2020, all the way to national, and not hear them talk about our democracy. And they mean it as a proper noun, so capital D, democracy. So if we are not a democracy, but the vast majority of people believe we are a democracy, well, what do we do with that? And as an educator, and particularly in the concept of civics, I find it vitally important. Now, we could have a very short session if I could just simply say it's okay for democracy and republic to be synonyms, because as you know, a synonym means, and I'm not the English grammar scholar, but basically the same thing. If they meant the same thing, we'd be good. Again, in a totally different presentation, which I won't go with, so you have to just believe me, they do not mean the same thing. And the Romans and the Athenians would be frustrated for you to tell them that they did the same thing, because they did not. So then you and I have to look at that in 2024 and say, well, how did we get here? And that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to introduce you to what I think is one of the most important political groups that most people have never heard of, that helps us kind of begin jump-starting the situation of how are we at a point where today, for most people, it is the fact that we are in a democracy, and they mean it in some loose way of, doesn't it mean majority rules, but it doesn't always seem to be that, but I guess it's sort of what it means, and so I'm just kind of with this weird definition that kind of makes our way into the story. And again, one of you said already, the confusion lies in the fact that we have a system kind of the people. Now there you could say a republic and a democracy are of the people, but people would also say that a social democratic system or socialism system that you see in some of our European friends, they would also say they're of the people. Now you can debate whether you agree with them or not, but, and again, I feel very confident that Mr. Putin would say, well, my system is of the people, meaning the people make all the decisions. And we just had an election, I got 98% of the vote, so obviously they're very happy with me. Most of us would say, I don't believe you, mostly because we know 98% of the people never agree on everything anywhere, so that seems it's a kind of a warning signal when I'm looking at the evidence. I'm like, that can't be right, would be what we would say. We could be wrong, he could be correct. 98% of the Russian people living there are very happy with the system, and then he would be correct in telling you and me it's of the people. So that's kind of this category, and that's what made the Romans and the Athenians so weird. And I have shown this slide before, I'm not showing it today, but in general terms, the system historically, which I would suggest you can hear echoes of around the world today, is what I call the power pyramid system, in which a small minority, either a single leader or a very small group of people, rule and control, and the majority, 80-90%, have no say in what goes on. That seems to be, well, historically, that is the pattern. So when the Romans and the Athenians tried this thing, and then when we in 1787 said, hey, let's try this thing, well, we were doing the abnormal thing. Now today, what we set out to do has become more normalized, and that's a whole different conversation which we won't have, as to where is the trend. When people will tell you, oh, the long arc of history moves to such and such. No, it doesn't. In fact, the long arc of history in governing systems leads back to what we would call dictatorship, but the general sense of the power pyramid. And there's a whole, I think, psychological reason why, but that's not the point. So what our founders were trying to do, and this kind of sets us up to make sure we're clear, is they were trying to find a middle road between what they, you could call snob rule, so that the ancient system, and mob rule. So these governing systems they wanted to try to avoid. And for the founders, uniformly, including Jefferson, who would have been the most, he and Franklin would have been the most comfortable with, let's roll the dice and do a democracy. And noting they meant a democracy, not a republic that we call a democracy. Okay? But they pulled back from that under mostly Madison's influence, but also, and you see Madison's position here, that he's thinking, look, these are bad. And the reasons they're bad is on our point of our conversation. He's joined by Adams. Adams is really the leading constitutional theorist and thinker in the early part of the country. Madison was just a young man kind of in school. But you can see what they're kind of looking at. Look, the systems that we have to find a way to kind of balance these things. This is the idea of balanced government that Montesquieu, of course, wrote about, but John Adams was really on the forefront, and from an American voice of saying, well, what do we mean? And again, think of it this way. All of us in this room, and I'll let you have 4 loved ones, are on the rocket ship to Mars. What government do you want to establish there? You have nobody making you do anything. And the 50, and now with your 4 friends, the 200 of us would need to debate and discuss, well, what do we think would be best? And imagine the whiteboard is completely clean. And you could throw up the ancient systems and the Americans and the Romans and whoever else you want to throw up, but all of us on the rocket could say, let's not do that, let's try something else. So now you're in charge. I'm going to put you in charge. You're the one with the pen at the board leading the group. Where will you lead us? And you wouldn't be evil no matter what you came up with, in Carl's opinion. But what would you come up with? That's what the Americans were doing. It's the singular moment, really, in history. You could say the Romans and the Athenians are there with us in their moments in history. But in their moments, particularly the Athenians evolved to democracy. The Romans are right out the gate with their system. So maybe it's us and the Romans. But you've got a blank slate. What do you want to do? And so they're thinking their way through, what do they know? And if we're wise on the rocket, you like me, will be thinking, well, what if we tried such, and somebody will say, wait, so-and-so did such and such at this other place. Here's how it worked out. What I typically tell my students is, and this may frustrate some of you, is that governing systems are amoral. So there's nothing morally evil about dictatorship or despotism or monarchy, just like there's nothing morally pure about democracy or republic. But I think the whole point that history helps us with is then I think back, well, where have I seen, different system, fascism or its ilk before? And then did it work out well? And would I want to live there? And for Carl, the answer would be a no. Okay, so if one of you is saying I'm setting up a system and I go, that sounds a lot like the variations of fascism, not that you're evil, I can't believe you. It's like, I think historically we should avoid that. That's the way it would be on our rocket ship to Mars. Of course, all of you are thinking, I'm not getting on the rocket ship until I know what the decision is, which I'm with you. We're all standing over here at Cape Canaveral going, I'm not getting on there till we sign on the dotted line, and we're all good in the system. And Adams, of course, led the way, and we've covered some of these when we've looked at John Adams before, so I won't be, kind of belabor the point here. Microsoft is telling me something. We'll say no and keep moving. So John is laying out what these systems, and they're thinking historically what we should do. And I think I just messed up that I'm not going to be able to use this thing here. So let's see if I can turn it off, turn it on. Jorge, I see you up there. I might make you come down here. Plug it back in, and see. We'll see if I can get it to go. It does not want to go. Jorge, I'm going to let you turn it off and turn it back on or whatever you do. So Adams is writing in this period of time. So look at me, don't look behind the screen. Don't look at the man behind the screen. He's writing, and he's the first one to kind of write out. And what he's answering is what I just told you to do. And in his opinion, the issue is that we have competing aspects of our society. I'll use an example we would have. So I would say, and hopefully most of you would say, well, we have men and we have women, and I would want the system to be balanced to allow for both, right? So that'd be an aspect of the government Carl would want to see happening. Does that make sense? And so then in that process, I would want you to then be thinking, okay, I'm gonna make that happen, and you might think of other things. So for Adams, you had the fact that you needed an executive, which is the equivalent of a king. You needed to respect the people. You need to give the people a voice somewhere. And you have a rich aristocracy, which we don't like to use that word, and Jefferson consistently bashed him about it, but he wasn't meaning a European version of the aristocracy based on blood. He meant wealth. Now you and I can say, I don't like that, I don't want there to be a special place for rich people to have their own thing, but his point was you need to find a space for them. And when he wrote the Massachusetts Constitution, that's precisely how he designed it. And you can see echoes of that in what Madison did. We have a House of the People, which up until the 1900s was known as the People's House. And then you had the Senate, which had nothing to do with the people. The Senate represented the states. And in Adams's mind, though he wouldn't have said it this way, that's Madison's way of saying it, but in Adams' mind, that's where your wealthy would be constrained. You almost could hear Adams say there would be a wealth limit of who could run for House of Representatives. And if you were above that limit, I wouldn't let you run. That's almost what you can hear Adam saying. And again, the point's not he's right or wrong. The point is for you and me to hear what's he doing. He's trying to find a way to balance the various groups that are on this rocket ship to Mars with you and me. So that's what he's thinking about as he's doing it. I'm going to go ahead while you're doing that and go to here. Oh, it's landing going to there. So we're going to come all the way out. Oh, it's all messed up now. Oh, there we go. So, in the United States, we kind of work our way forward. They reject democracy, as I said. And so we're happy. Everybody's in a republic. Everybody's good. And yet we get to the 20th century, we're not good anymore. Right? So what happens? It happens in the 19th century. It actually starts with Andrew Jackson. I'm going a little faster here so we can get back to our speed. But it also happens because of things coming along from Europe. So de Tocqueville very famously comes over here, and his book he called Democracy in America. Because he used democracy as the first word, it's capitalized. It's not clear to me in reading Democracy in America he meant it as a proper noun. It's possible he did, but in much of his writing he does seem to be speaking about it, small d, as in essence like an adjective. It's like this is a style of government they have, but it's not a proper noun. But when he writes about it, he is obviously talking about the fact that as he's going across America compared to his experience in Europe, as you said correctly, the people have voice, the people have agency, the people have the ability to make the communication. They have a way to kind of work their way out. You can go all the way out if you need to, brother. I think you might need to go all the way out. We're just having all right, Jorge. Winter Park Library. Yeah, give him props. My man.
Thank you.
Andrew Jackson is the first one to kind of openly talk about, hey, I got screwed in an election because aren't we a democracy? Jackson, I think, is blending small d democracy, capital D democracy, but he makes his position clear. He does use it as an adjective when he creates a new political party. He splits the single party that existed, the Republicans, that's Jefferson's Republicans, and he splits them by calling out the Democratic Republicans between the 24 and 28 election because, again, in his mind, I got screwed in 24. I got the most votes, which he did. But in a democracy, he would have won. He wasn't in a democracy, he was in a republic, so the rules happened differently, and he didn't win. And so he was mad, the fact that he didn't win. And so he spent 4 years moaning about it and galvanizing people and kind of working off of Jefferson's playbook and Jefferson's songbook. I find it very ironic that Jefferson, before he dies in 26, is horrified about Andrew Jackson. It's like, I can't believe that people are doing this. And I would love to be able to go back and talk to him and say, Tom, Andrew is the natural outcome of your position. But that's a whole conversation about Jefferson. Some of you know that we don't want to go there. Now, John Stuart Mill writes in the middle, right around the time of the Civil War, he's the first one to really philosophically begin laying this out. To say, now, well, maybe Jackson's right and we can start making it a proper noun, but we're going to kind of dovetail in aspects of a republic. Again, just to make sure you're clear, I should have probably done this. Democracy, all decisions are made by all the citizens all the time. There's no decision not made by all the citizens all the time. That's a democracy. In a republic, groups of people are chosen by the people, at least some of the leaders, chosen by the people, and then those people are freed to make the decisions for the people, but typically not in accordance with what the people want. We're not asking what the people want. You wanted me, so now that you got me, I'm using my own intellect to decide these things. And I have to obviously interface with other representatives of the people. So if you said, but wait, Carl, on the rocket ship to Mars, everybody won't agree with you. Absolutely. That's why there'll be a plurality of many representatives, and they will represent different ideas because different voting blocks will vote for someone, and then they'll do their thing. But they will not come back to us and ask our opinion. Now, there's a whole debate amongst political scientists about how much should representatives ask for the people's input, and that's a whole different conversation. But just keeping it in simple terms, 'cause I'm a simple guy, democracy, all the citizens vote on all the issues all the time. So again, as I said, we are now alive at a time where we could easily be a democracy. And if you think we should be, you should start banging the drum to make it happen, because we have the technology to do it. You probably wouldn't get anything else done in your life because your phone would blow up at least every hour, in which you'd have to cast a vote. Every hour, maybe every 30 minutes. But we could vote, and then be decided. The end, because majority rules. That's the end of the story. There is no other story. If your governing system, which as you know ours does not have consistently majority rules, it's clearly not a democracy. It's something else. That's just a simple way of understanding it. Okay. Let's see, Mills is saying, hey, wait a minute, maybe we could do something and call it democracy by using representation. Of course, I would say to Mills what I say to most people: you've got a perfectly good word already. Why do you need to do that? But you can already begin to see Mills is in this, and he's out in front of everybody else. Up to this point, I'm sure they exist, but I defy you to find any political leader who used the term America is a democracy in any speech, in any writing, in any documentation. No newspaper said it. They would talk again and again and again. That's what we are, a republic. Over and over and over and over again. Right, that changes in the early 20th century. We'll show you why in a second. It didn't help in the sense of wanting the two words to stay separate. It didn't help of what England was doing. So England, remember, we rebel against England. And so we're the ones out in front of England. But then arguably, through the 19th century, England moves far faster than the United States in the realm of becoming more democratic. Now, they never technically go there. They're still to this day a constitutional monarchy. If you were paying attention a few years ago, you saw the new king get crowned. So they're a monarchy. They have a hereditary deal, and that's a whole different conversation. But nonetheless, you can see through this series of things how they are expanding access to government. And again, think broader, back to the term government of the people. So one of our arguments if you try to understand why we fought a revolutionary war, why did we go to war with them, is because we were creating a new definition about representation. Because in America, all the colonies, which had set up some version of a republic, or in some cases a version of a democratic constitutional monarchy, more people got to vote for the representatives. And one representative might have as many as 1,000 people voting for them, which sounds really small to you and me, because that doesn't happen in our day, where we still have now I think, aren't our Florida representatives voted on by something like 500,000 people? Which, just think about that just for a second. How ludicrous it is to think that one human can represent adequately 500,000 people. Different conversation. But in England, you might find representatives voted on by 5 people, 10 people, 15 people. So in 1775, we're saying, hey, that's not good enough. Now England in the 19th century goes, you're right, it's not good enough. And they expanded further and further and further and further, far faster than the United States ever did. So this idea of people having agency, having access, being able to vote, leads us to this group I wanted to tell you about. Because after the war, when you study, so our AMH 2020 and most of your classes, if you took American history, there's 2 parts. There's the part 1, setting up, colonizing, and goes to where? The Civil War. Then the next one starts where? Civil War, right? A simplistic way to look and say, well, what was happening is that the country did not recover well after the Civil War. And it didn't recover well because there was a lot of changes going on. There's the rise in America, it already happened in England in particular, but in Europe, of industrialism. With industrialism was the rise of urbanism, so people were fleeing. Still the majority in 1900 still lived on the farms, but it was rapidly changing on the journey that it is today. How many people, millions, have moved to Florida, but they've all come to Tampa and Orlando and Miami and maybe Jacksonville. They're all here, right? That's why you can go out to Christmas and still find lots of empty land, because they're all coming where? To the cities. That's a 20th century phenomenon. And so, there's all these changes that are occurring. The South obviously is still devastated from the war, and then becomes really gripped with the crisis and largely the failure of dealing with civil rights. So all these things begin to percolate in the minds of the people to say a version of, something's not right. Something's not working. And out of that comes our next most important third party. As we head towards an election, I always take it a chance to say it if I can. Don't listen to the lies of the monopoly, the Republicrats, when they tell you that you can't vote for a third party because it ruins everything, or third parties have never been successful, which is really hypocritical coming from the Republicans because they were a third party in 1856. So vote for who you wish, and don't let the monopoly convince you otherwise. And don't let people scare tactics you, which is really happening in this election. I'll try not to say more about this election. So they were very successful in building momentum because they had a gripe. And their gripe was, something's wrong. Now, who's saying it? Well, this leads us back to democracy. The people are largely saying it. Hence, this group will begin to coalesce around the people on the ground. It begins in the West. So not surprisingly, at the center of it were farmers. Also, in a smaller amount, miners. But just think about everybody who developed the West. Professor Salma was here recently. We did the West. Who goes to the West? The farmers, the ranchers, the miners. You know, there's people coming in, obviously, to California. But in general terms, those are the industries, the timber industry in the Northwest a little bit. But that's who's here. So the average regular person, and the average regular person from 1870 to 1900 was saying, something's not right. I don't feel well represented. Clearly by this point, when you think of the urbanism and the industrialism, what you're dealing with is a very clear division between a more rich, more developed industrial East and a rural West. Now, you might say, why not a rural South? I'll get to that in a second, but there's some churn in the South as well to say, hey, I don't think this is working out well. And so we're frustrated. And they, like many people today, looked at both political parties and said, they seem blind and or deaf or uncaring about my concerns. All right? And so in a government of the people, they should at least have some level of care. And so there's these issues happening in the West that leads certain leaders to begin to coalesce. Actually, the first time that it's kind of building, well, it starts here with the group called the Grange Movement, and then it'll eventually coalesce in a thing called the Farmers Alliance. But again, they're just kind of getting this sense of frustration. Again, as a farmer, in this period moving into industrialism, you and I know this very well. I'm going to assume that you know this very well. The price of our gas is determined by world events and guided by the commodities market. And go back and watch Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy's movie, Trading Places, if you don't think you understand the commodities market. It's similar, but not exactly the same as the stock market. But gas is not determined by some guy over here in Central Florida or over on the coast who's making oil into gas and he just sells it to us. So, when we get frustrated, when our bread prices go up, you should ask yourself, what's happening in the world that's impacting wheat? Oh wait, one of the world's wheat producers was invaded in a war? No wonder, right? No wonder cereal's like $14 now. You know, why is that the case? Because it's made from grains. Who produces grains? A large part of it from Ukraine. So the world's commodity market's like, oh, I don't know if I can handle this, and prices go through the roof and go crazy, right? Does that make sense for everybody? So when you know that, you're not less mad because you just walk past the cereal aisle going, I guess I'm not getting cereal. I need to take out a loan or something to get a box of cereal. But you can say, I understand why it's happening. At this moment, nobody understands this. You're at a time when Joe Farmer, Sally Seamstress would be making their goods and selling them to their neighbors. But things have changed. The commodities market begins. The railroad is now looping the country together. And so now, if I wanted to, I could sell my grains further afield. I could be living in Nebraska and sell them in Chicago. But then that means the prices are not set by me and what's happening in my local setting. And to a large degree, they're not dumb, but they don't understand it. It's sort of how I feel about modern technology. I don't understand it. I look at phones and I look at things and I'm talking about something and then my phone shows me an ad, which means it's listening to me, but I don't do any of those things. And now I'm going to have soon my own R2-D2, which is going to figure things out for me. And I just hope it doesn't turn evil, you know, and become like 2001. But I don't understand it. I don't get it. I listen to my friends, but I'm like, yep, I'm too old. That ship has sailed. And so, you know, that's sort of where they're at. What's the world going to be like? Don't know. You and I can look back and understand that they had a hard time with it. So they felt frustrated. They were having farms defaulted on by banks, and they're taking loans, and then it's like just this churn that was happening to them. You're like, this can't be right. So, in 1890, right here in Ocala, well, up in Ocala, this first group of people met. In 1891, they met in Cincinnati, and then they met in St. Louis, and then in 1892 in Omaha, as they prepared for the national election, they met and they created a platform. This group would call itself the Populist Party. Now, I stop here just for a quick second. Try in your mind to separate the ideas of what you might know as populism, which is something that has resurfaced in modern political conversation over the past decade. To some degree, separate that from the Populist Party. Okay, so just keep those two separate. And they set out a platform, and they told the American people, here's what we believe in. And so what they believed in were these things. Most of this you should say, oh, I see all that. But at the time that they said it, nobody would have, these did not exist in the country. And in large measure, most people would have said these are bad. You want an income tax, a tax on our income? That's not, no, we don't do that. You want to have the government dictate wage rules? We don't do that. So they were really on the cutting edge of what will become normative for you and me in the 20th century. The first ones to say these things out loud in sort of a platform setting. To say, if you elect us, this is what we're going to do. And everything except for the sub-treasury plan to control and impact the banks, which really to some degree does happen, as I'll show you with the Federal Reserve. All these things happen, every one of them. But at the time they said it, these were radical, revolutionary, and by many people considered dangerous. In this conversation, what they're pointing to, or what they perceive to be the enemies of the people. The enemies of the people are these forces that are now controlling how their lives unfold in a way that they cannot directly unfold. Go back to the farmer who 20 years before could set the price for his grain that he sold to the local market because it was just all in that very local market. And now all of a sudden, he couldn't do that. He was going to need to travel his grain on a railroad. They were going to charge him money. He had no influence on what their charging would be. When it got to market, it was going to be sold by a price that was set not by him, but by some rich people who were playing the market. Banks were going to be involved in all that. So for the Populist Party, a way to understand their view was to see them as saying, evil giants are roaming the land. And as you can see in the paintings, I don't know if you can see them well enough back there, here you have a group of giants who are kind of on the back of all the common people. Oh, my thing just went totally out. I'm having a technology issue today. This won't work either. Over here you can see this is a government here, the one in the brown, because they're basically these giants over the elected officials who control them. Right? And so they thought, well, we've got to find a solution to make our way through that. And again, their idea was we could be the group who would lead them to a new future, a new location, a new place. That's what, no, this is fine, just that. And so they did very well in the election. And again, they're trying to point out that the problem is the giant. So then now think about it, just keep it in the metaphor with me. If there are giants roaming the land that you and I cannot impact because we're too small, to the Populist Party, there was only one solution, and that was to get their own giant. We needed to have our own giant who could fight for us. Well, where are you going to get that giant? To them, the only option was we get the giant of government. But wait, government is on the list of enemies. How could we get government so that you and I could control it? The government is corrupt. And that was, again, on their list of enemies. Government's corrupt. And their solution was, we need, the way I say it, a cleansing agent. We need a bleach. We need something that can put the giant under our control. And that was democracy. To the Populist Party, they believed that democracy could be a cleansing agent to government so that government could then be controlled by the people in a democratic way that would then go and fight for us against the enemies. And we'll stop there for a second. Does that make sense to everybody? Again, government is on the list of enemies. Who are the enemies? The bankers, the rich people, the industrialists, the railroad, and the government. Because it's corrupt, it's dirty. These are giants roaming the land. We got to fix it. Well, I don't know. Collectively, we can't be a giant. We need our own giant. Who could be a giant we could control? Government. If we make the government under our control, we then can pull that off. This message resonated. And by the time the election's happening in the fall of '92, there are groups that are not part of the original Farmers Alliance or People's Party who are coming to join them. And you can see them listed there at the bottom. So they do very well in this election, as you can see there in the green. They get roughly 2% of the vote, 5% of the Electoral College, which I know is small, but starting from zero, that's good momentum. And they actually had taken control of some state legislatures or had some state legislators elected in the process. They had run James Weaver as their candidate, and they do well. Their messaging works really well. Grover Cleveland, who was at odds with his own party, basically, which is why he did not run or win the nomination in the previous '88 election, had come back to run in '92, and he wins the election in '92. But he wins the election largely because of the discontentment within the Democratic Party with the old status quo. So they're kind of supporting him as a reformer. Really, Cleveland could arguably be named as the first presidential reformer, though he's not in the same line as the three progressive presidents that I'm going to introduce to you in a little bit. Right? So it doesn't look great, but I want to point out to you something. It's actually stronger than, I'm going to come back to this slide. Look at the by-county vote. Right? Now, it's still not like somehow they were in the majority. They weren't. But you can see there's a lot of green across the map. You're like, oh. And in fact, when you dig into the election in the South, you can then say, wait, I bet it was even higher. Now again, not to get us off track, but when you get into the South, you run headlong into the system that had emerged in the South post-Civil War, in which if you were white, you voted Democratic or you're going to get a visit by the Klan. You'd be a traitor to your race if you didn't vote Democratic. So that by the 1890s, there's really only one party in the South, and that will last up until arguably the 1970s. And the Democratic Party, some of you may know this because you may have had this experience as a Democrat, or your parents may have, there'd be a liberal version of the Democrats in the South, there'd be a conservative, and they'd run against each other in the local elections for sheriff and school board and all these things. But they were all Democrats. Even though you would probably say, I think you're two different parties because you have two different worldviews seemingly in these elections. But why can't you just say you're something else? Because, oh, no, I don't want to get a visit from the guys in the sheets. And that happened. Our version of cancel culture, that's way back. That's old. That's ostracism. That's not a new thing. That's an old thing. And so they were able to use that, Democratic leaders in the South were able to use that in a way that they could keep people from voting. Obviously, they were not letting black people vote at all. The black vote had basically vanished by 1876 because there was no way they were allowed to vote. And so they were able to have more of these counties in the South, all be red. If you look closely, it's kind of hard to see from where you are. There's different shades of red, right? And so if you look where Ocala is, it's a lighter shade of red, which would lead us to believe that had there been not this racist effort by the Democrats, probably you would have seen some green counties in the state. So all this meaning the populists are very encouraged. Remember in 1856, the Republicans were the fifth party. They shocked everybody by coming second. They replaced the going at that point second party, the Whigs, and a couple other parties that everybody thought would be more popular. So for the populists now in '92, they're like, oh man, we got momentum. And the '94 election will work to their advantage also. They'll pick up more congressional seats and more state seats. Momentum was building. And as you kind of work their way in, they got a benefit. They got a benefit because of this. Our next economic depression happened. So between the 92 and 96 election, there's another economic depression. And you might think, well, how does this help the Populist Party? Well, the Populist Party had as a centerpiece of their platform, which you saw on the list, an economic wing. And their economic wing was that silver should be allowed to use as currency. Now this gets us into a whole economic conversation which we don't have time for. And most economists would tell you that if a society, so on your rocket ship to Mars, keep this in mind, if a society has two different ways of measuring their currency, that's not good. Currently, ours was an economy based on gold. So any paper you might have had, greenbacks or dollars, basically that was promised on gold. As you know, in the 20th century, we leave the gold standard. And now it's what's called fiat money or a fiat economy, and it basically just means the dollar is worth what people believe about the sustainability of the country. That's the short version. It's deeper than that. But where the Populist Party coming from? The West. So who's in their group? Miners. When the industrial thing was happening well, and the commodities market was really rocking, you could sell your silver for more money to industrialists who are then learning that silver becomes an amazing conductor of electricity. So there's use for silver in industry. But when the economy tanks and when it's not strong in industry, silver is not worth as much, and so now I've got this silver, which I think is a valuable thing. Can't I buy this food from you by trading you silver? That's their argument. I'm not saying it's a workable or even good argument, but to the populists rolling into the 96 election, we're going to be so successful. It's interesting to note at this time you start seeing open labor strikes, which are playing into the populist agenda. Again, who runs the industries? Well, these rich people, these rich industrialists, in some cases these robber barons, which may not be a fair terminology, but if you hear the terminology, just accept it for what it's saying. What have they done? They've robbed, and now they're acting like a baron, a leader in the feudal market, which that's not what we do, right? So bad on both sides of that phrase. As an example of their frustration, there is one of arguably the first, but certainly in the vein of our idea of one of the four founding themes of America, and one of those is rebellion, a march on Washington. A man named Jacob Coxey from Ohio, he was not alone, there were others from other parts of the country, decided what we need to do is march to Washington with the demand that the government do something about the economy. Now let me just stop here for a second so you can kind of get the sense of where they're coming from. If you ask every founder except Alexander Hamilton, what should the government do? The answer would be nothing. Don't do anything. And if you go, why? They would say, have you looked around at the governments? Why would you want them to do anything? Back to, don't we have rights? As this young lady here said, don't we have rights? Not if the government tells you what you can and cannot do. You don't have rights. And so the founders are like, we want a very limited government, a Lockean kind of way that just, sort of does a few things. Run the post office and then leave us alone. And now here come the populists. Remember, they've already kind of crossed that barrier because they're saying we need a giant that we can control to fight for us. And so what are they saying? We need the government to fix the economy. And their arguments will resonate with several people in this room. They're like, well, they should be doing some infrastructure work. There's roads they could be building. And if they go and fix those roads, you'd give me a job. You got the money to pay for it. And then, there are some people who just need a handout because we're starving. And you should care as the government, and you should just hand it out. Now, again, this cuts against what the founders believed. Because what the founders believed, you needed government to be weak. How did you make the government weak? Well, you don't let it do anything. Well, how do you pull that off? You give it no money. The government should have no money at all, or very little, which is why Jefferson, who in his first term, I argue, had the best four-year term of any president. What's the leading thing he did? He slashed the budget. I mean, imagine what would happen. Let's skip this election, but in a future election, if a president rolled in, and the first thing, I'll go with the world I want to have, she does is she cuts the budget by 75%. Think of all the things the government does. The government helps keep the lights on in this building. 75%. We would all just be in shock, and we wouldn't even know how to handle ourselves because it's so unknown to our world from the past 125, 50 years. Does that make sense? But the founders like, that's a good government. And Jefferson said it famously, a good government is one that governs the least. And when he heard Hamilton say things like, a good government is energetic and constant, he's like, oh my God, who is this guy? This guy's dangerous. He's a terrible person. He's a threat to our republic. Hence, Jefferson, I'm going to start a political party. What's it going to be called? The Republicans. I'm going to defend the republic that I let us in when I wrote a Declaration of Independence. That's Jefferson's whole thing. So these guys are saying, no, no, no. And so Coxey goes. Remember, who's in office? He's a reformer, Cleveland. When he gets there, he has Coxey arrested. Coxey goes up to the Capitol, goes to the steps of the Capitol to make a speech, and is arrested before he says a word, arrested on trespassing. He and a handful of the others. Of course, everybody else disperses. If you really want to kind of measure the growth of where we go, you can kind of look at the government's response in the 1872 to 75 Depression, the government's response and the people's expectations in the 1890s Depression, and then look at the government's response and the people's expectation in the 1929 Depression. When you compare those, you can see it. You're like, oh, wow. It's a short period of time in which the people changed drastically. So the 1896 election, the Populists said, we're going to win. We're going to win. We're going to win big. We're very excited. They made a strategic decision that was a disaster. Thank you, sir. What they assumed was that both of the main parties would come along and that they would choose to elect on their normative stance, which would be a pro-gold limited government action, particularly the Democrats. Because think about it, the last thing the Democrats would want was an activist government trying to tell them how they should be treating African Americans in their communities. So we don't want an activist government. It's the populist viewpoint. The Republicans go first, and the populists are correct. Yay! In many senses, you could say the 96 election was bought and paid for by the industrialists, because McKinley said basically, I will be the opposite of Cleveland. Because remember, Cleveland was still a reformer. And so, yay. But then, tragically, to the populists, something happened at the Democratic Convention. Now, keep in mind at this point, unlike today, where we have, usually 10 states vote, and then that's who we're having to choose as our candidate, which that seems to be problematic to me. But in any case, they didn't do that at all. You just showed up at the convention, and then you made a decision, right? And it was going the way it was assumed it would go, which is a pro-gold stance, which again, from the populists, we will then stand out as this alternative to the pro-industrialist, pro-status quo candidate. But you know how these conventions go, because when they take over our TV, most of us are old enough in the room we actually still watch, or we remember when TV only had 3 channels and you had to watch. What happens? They make a bunch of speeches. They're pointless speeches because they've already decided who the candidate is, and then they go through the motions of California and IR-45 and the delegates go blah, 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 right? We all know how that story goes. But at this point, it actually mattered. In the 1860 nominating convention for the Republicans, Lincoln was not the first choice of anybody. And there was all this rigmarole that happened behind the scenes until finally all the leading candidates realized they could never have the party coalesce around them, and so then they all said, well, I guess I'll take Lincoln. He's our secondary candidate. Into the story comes William Jennings Bryan. Now, Bryan was understanding what the populists were arguing, and he largely agreed with them. So he gets up and makes a very famous speech in which he electrified the crowd. He was quite an eloquent speaker, and he electrified the crowd. And out of nowhere, because he was not expecting it, nor necessarily, who wouldn't want to be nominated, but he's not thinking it's going to happen. He's not trying to be nominated. Suddenly, the kind of pro-populist view in the Democratic Party begins to galvanize behind this man because of his eloquence. And he is, out of nowhere, chosen as their Democratic candidate. And what that meant for the populists was that their thunder was stolen. They're like, oh, shoot, who do we pick? And there's a battle that happened within the Populist Party. And the short version is that they chose to also nominate William Jennings Bryan, which makes no sense to most of us. And in doing so, they gave away their independence and their kind of identification strategy as we're something different. So in that process of choosing Bryan, they kind of had died in their ideas. Now, the 1896 election is kind of maybe worthy of its own talk all on its own, but I want to be mindful of the time and kind of walk us through kind of where we are in the process. Just understand that the Populist Party will die in the 1896 election because they did not choose to identify themselves separately from Bryan. What they hoped is that somehow when he was elected, he would suddenly announce himself to be a populist, which you and I could know, why would he ever do that? He would never have done that. It's the silliest thing to have decided as your strategy. And so they should have picked their own because, as you know from their platform, they had many other things that separated them from the other two main parties, and they should have really hammered down on this. This might be a great example of how the populists and the voting populists often will go with, oh, but the other guy's scary, so I gotta vote for this person who I don't like. I don't think that's a good strategy for the country. And so it kind of, from the populist point of view here, totally backfires. It doesn't really play out well because obviously, again, they die in the process. Now, Bryan, from a sense of the value of studying the 96 election, I mean, he will actually go and crisscross the country himself, and he'll talk to people. The Republicans did the old system in which basically McKinley didn't do any campaigning, and they just counted on using the newspapers to convince people. And he won quite handily, and then you know he will be reelected in 1900, again, very handily in the 1900 election. And so, well, what does this mean for us? Again, to our larger topic of like, how do we end up in this place with democracy? So you've now had a group that has verbalized and put into political practice this idea that some like Mills and maybe Andrew Jackson, but Mills in particular, maybe to Tocqueville, were suggesting that couldn't the word democracy be somehow an equivalent for republic? And again, in their minds, think back to the description I gave to you for poor African Americans in the South. In their minds, the populists were thinking, if we could have more democracy, which would certainly equal more citizens voting, then we could have a true representation of what the people want. And it, again, like a cleansing agent, a bleach, could clean up the corruption of the government and then allow for righteousness and holiness to reign, as democracy would be this moral force for good. Does that make sense for everybody? Now again, if the story stopped here, we would probably be perplexed because, well, you said their party died, so that's sort of the end of the story. But their idea doesn't die. Because William Jennings Bryan successfully introduced some of the concepts that the populists believed into the Democratic Party, they're going to begin to really start pushing. What's also happening at this point is the fact that there are many young people who had grown up after the Civil War who would agree with the Populist Party and begin to take matters into their own hands and begin to do a variety of things that are down that road of what does it mean to live where we live and how can we use democracy as a cleansing agent to better our society, right? These people will ultimately be called the version of progressives. Progressivism will emerge as you roll into the 20th century as the energy of the Populist Party. It's important to notice a key difference in that we talk about the Populist Party and the progressive movement. The progressives will never coalesce into a party. There will be a wide disparity of ideas that they will kind of work out in the arenas that matter to them. To the point that if you tried to create a party, as Teddy Roosevelt does try in 1912, it will get nowhere because you're going to have people who will be a progressive in the thing that matters to them, but will not agree with other ideas of progressivism that they don't like. Does that make sense? And you'll see this as I start working our way through through the process. So there's a whole host of young leaders, men and women, who were raised, went to college, born, raised, went to college in the 19th century, who watched the Populist Party, who heard their call for more democracy, and said, you know what, I think there's energy there. They knew the platform. Again, the populist platform was wildly popular, which is, again, this tragedy of 1896. that they didn't push down that road and said, look, our platform, vote for us. I'm not saying they would have won in 96 because McKinley was too deeply financed. And you already, long before McKinley, you see the value of which candidate has the most money most often will win, which is a whole different conversation and thing to maybe try to fix. But they certainly would have, there was a really high potential for them, if not becoming the number 2 party, bringing the country to a status where you had 3 viable parties. There's a way to see the next 3 decades, at least until you get to the Great Depression, as the United States having 3 active parties with a third, 30, 30, 40. And really seeing certain parts of the country in that political vein. But they didn't. So they died as a party, but their ideas live on and kind of push us through. Now, it's important to note, just so you can kind of understand the political status of the time. Both parties had what was called at the time the Old Guard. And the Old Guard was very determined, and we'll go forward and I'll come back. And these aren't to scale from a sense of perspective, but in both parties, you have a progressive impulse. You have progressive leaders in both parties. Again, where are we coming from? Post-Civil War, something's wrong. Something's not working. And if you went to the cities, you saw all kinds of issues in the cities. If you went to the farms, you went to the South, you went into the industrial workers. You know, all the issues that if you've ever studied the early 20th century, you know of these things: child labor, long labor laws, bad housing, unsafe conditions, dirty water to drink, etc., etc., etc. The country was largely in agreement with the populace that something's not right. It shouldn't be like this. How do we fix it? Well, they tried their way. They die as a party, but their ideas kind of live on. But these guys, no. And this is an overgeneralization. Well, I would say this is a generalization of both parties. But you've got this old guard who are determined to fight back. A way really to understand the 2 parties that we have rolling into the 20th century is to see both parties in something like a tug of war. Like, we're the progressives. No, we're the progressives. But at the same time, I'm a Democrat polling, we're the progressives. I got the old guard over here, not polling and trying to get my hands off the rope. And the same thing, so it's kind of like, we're the progressives, leave me alone. We're the progressives. That's the tension we are in. This should also make you feel better if you're worried about your current political party, because you know you're in a civil war right now within your political party. Both parties are. Not our first rodeo. We do this a lot, where you have a gathering of people underneath the banner, and at some time, some things begin to happen to where a group within that goes, I'm not happy with this anymore. And they leave, or they try to take over, or they do different things. And it's always a hoot. We don't know who's going to work out, but that's kind of where we're going. Does that make sense for everybody? Okay. So into this comes a group of these young people. These are all young people in the late 1890s who will then step into action. These aren't the only pictures I'm going to show you. There's several people who go down this road. And they will become examples or exemplars of progressivism. But again, just in looking at this list, if you know anything about this list, you can say those 5 dudes do not agree about much. Which again is the point. I could be a progressive and disagree with this other person who is equally a progressive. It's just they're progressive about something that I think is terrible. Does that make sense? Which is why it can't coalesce. But that's also, I think, beneficial, particularly if you like what the progressives thought, because it gives it a wide berth to seep into everything. And it will. Here's a spoiler alert. Progressivism, for good or ill, will become the dominant viewpoint of the country, and still is to this day. Regardless of what you think about somebody you know who's in a different political party that you think they're crazy or they're evil, I can guarantee you they're progressive. We've arguably had only one president since 1900 who wasn't progressive, and I'll leave you to figure that out for yourself. So that doesn't mean that they agree with each other, just like these guys didn't. But you could be progressive and say, oh, there's 40 things. These 8, I'm progressive. That makes me progressive. What about these other 32? Nah, those are crazy. And then over here, somebody else going, no, these are the 8. Can you see how that both gives wide latitude, but obviously lots of room for conflict, because who's going to decide what's progressive? Okay. when I've been saying progressive, and we remind yourself what the populists said, but what does this mean? So this is Carl's take. You may not agree with it, but I think it matches the evidence in a superficial and, again, generalized kind of way. When you say progressive, here's what they meant. Here's how it worked out as you rolled into the 20th century. These concepts became the dominant viewpoint of how do we fix these things that are the problem. Well, you need experts. You have to realize you're helping people who are less fortunate, who do not have the money and or the power. They cannot help themselves. We're going to use a whole bunch of systems, including education. Education becomes the panacea for a lot of things, which as an educator, I'm glad. And at the same time, I'm like, maybe you're asking us for more than we actually technically can pull off. And as with the populists, you do all this through the government, cleaned up by more democracy. This is the marching orders. And if you pay attention as you study the American system through the 20th century, you'll go, oh yeah, I see it, there it is. There it is. Now who's kind of leading the way? Well, there's lots of groups. Again, lots of people will be progressive, will be trying to push for better things. You could arguably say it's a major outcome, if not the major outcome, of our third spiritual awakening, which is, again, a whole other talk to itself, so I won't bore you with it. But if you've ever studied the American story, again, I've told you our 4 founding themes. One of those is Christianity. And so there's this thing that happens every 80 years called the Great Awakening. So we run into our third Great Awakenings. There's a whole bunch of religious and spiritual outcomes which doesn't have anything to do with you and me in this conversation. But every one of them has what I say as the non-Christian outcome that impacts the country. And for this one, it was the idea of social justice. Most of you in the room look old enough, few of you maybe not. Remember those WWJD bracelets? That is a progressive mantra that got picked back up in the late 80s, early 90s. And kids started running around, maybe some of you did, with your little bracelet on. WWJD. And it comes off of Sheldon's book, In His Steps, which he wrote to confront Christians living in these places where you're saying something's wrong. And he's like, yeah, something's wrong, and you're the one who should go fix it. And he was basically saying to them, hey, if you're a Christian, aren't you walking in Jesus' steps? If you're walking in Jesus' steps and you see dirty water, or you see poor people, or you see a lack of education, you should do something. So that idea of social justice and sort of taking action on my own becomes an example of that kind of idea. And here's where you get your first concepts of the idea of social work or social workers. And Jane Addams and Helen Gates Starr are the first ones to lead us there. They're really populist, but I show them to you now because it just makes more sense in the flow of the conversation. But when the Populist Party was going on and they're leaving college, particularly Jane Addams, she's searching for a vision in life. She knows she's of a wealthy family and she claims to be a Christian, and so I should do something. And when she was in England and she saw the very first, we would call it a community center today, called Toynbee Hall, she's like, I could do that. She comes back to Chicago. She buys a gigantic house that's on a corner, still there today, called the Hull House. And she sets up the first community center, which did, all these types of things and more. To do what? Go back to what is progressivism. Help those less fortunate, help those who can't help themselves. Experts lead, she's the expert. If we need a lawyer, we go get a lawyer. If we need an accountant, we go get an accountant. We go get an educator to teach these people how to speak English. We help them with their different, they're showing up with tenant agreements. They can't read those well. We will help you, we'll protect you. The first social workers. Anybody who's in social work, whether privately or with the government, they owe their kind of legacy back to these two women here. Two of the most important Americans in the late 19th century in the story. Social issues. You highlight these. So what we're going to do now is I'm kind of just walking you through the different aspects of progressivism. We know this. We see it all around us. We all remember Geraldo Rivera. Well, he's still alive, I think, but we still remember these whole things. Remember 60 Minutes when it first started. The whole point was doing what? Investigative journalism and then showing us, right? That all goes back to Jacob Riis. in his book, How the Other Half Lives, he uses photography. He's the first one to use photography like this. One of the first ones to use kind of the ability to take a picture in the dark, basically. And he published it. He's highlighting these ills, at least initially, just for the rich of New York. I just watched something today, it has nothing to do with us, about environmental issues and humpback whales in Antarctica. And the person who's being interviewed said one of our growing strategies to try to save Antarctica is ecotourism. And she goes on to describe the more people who come up here, that we can show them the melting ice and show you the humpback whales, the more they will care. She got all that from Reese. Reese is like, look at this picture. Look at this situation. And there's a whole host of pictures which I have, and we don't have time to go through it. So you should go back and examine it. And they're the kind of pictures that we now know very famously of investigative journalism to demonstrate to people who could arguably say, I didn't know. Okay, fine. You won't go down there. But let me show you what it's like. And then, back to Sheldon, you should care. You should somehow contribute to making this better. Again, this is all progressivism. There will be a movement to fix economy. How do we make economics better? This one will take longer to get going. It'll really get its momentum coming out of the First World War, as you'll start having your first economists like John Maynard Keynes and Friedrich von Hayek, who really start kind of speaking out and writing. But at this point in Europe, socialism is building. You can make I think a fair approximation to say our progressive, I don't mean this is not a negative, our progressivism is equivalent to their socialism. But if you look and study the early socialists in the 19th century in Europe, what are you trying to do? Make the world a better place. Help these people who are poorer than I am. Help people who are less fortunate. People who can't help themselves. How are you going to do that? Through education, through providing them housing, providing them health care. The same sort of mantra. Now I know that socialism has a journey and it goes on a different road and there's a whole bunch more to it than that, but if you just see it at a simple level, hopefully you'll go, oh, okay, yeah, I see that. But we have a socialist movement happening here as well. And Eugene Debs, another one of the early populists who becomes a key progressive, is another example of this. He gets his kind of teeth cut in the whole story of the unions, kind of moving his way, as a union leader, protecting the unions as they're fighting first at the railroad, losing, going to jail. And so now you see this idea of kind of collectivism, collective activity, people in a certain workforce realizing I can't convince the industrialist to do X, particularly not by myself because I'm replaceable, but if we all go together. And then as the union thing goes forward, you have more unions going, hey, instead of just being a union of machinists, maybe we should be a union of just industrial workers, because then there's even more of us. Go watch the Disney movie Newsies. Great little movie, great musical. You can see Batman when he's a little kid. If you know the reference, I won't say anymore. Christian was good. I skipped away. But what's that movie about? It's about early union work and the collectivism growing again. This is a progressive concept. Because again, what we're trying to fix a thing that's wrong in the society. You start seeing different states take their own action. So to kind of lead back to the picture I showed you of the politicians, Teddy Roosevelt gets elected to the governor of New York, coming out of his fame in the Spanish-American War. And he becomes a dominant and arguably the most important progressive. And he will lead the state of New York through a series of reforms. He had attempted this before when he was just a legislator and often found his reforms thwarted. And so now he's the governor. He's going to make it happen. And he does, quite successfully. And again, if you look at this list, it's just a short list. Like here's an example, right? 8-hour workday. Where'd that come from? The Populist. He's joined in the Republican Party with William La Follette in Wisconsin, and will follow suit and do some of the same things. The Follettes really in Wisconsin are really the first to think back to the democracy point of our conversation of how do we get the more democracy? I'm going to show you some examples in a minute, but the Wisconsin are really the first ones that kind of go there. But there again, the state income tax. Hey, the government should control the food law. This is before we have the FDA. They're the first ones to kind of do it. Let's have a minimum wage. Let's make sure that's right. And here's that direct primary system. Again, all these are in that arena of ways to clean up. And again, for them, they're calling it more democracy. Later, a decade later, when the Democratic Party is trying to break the stranglehold that the Republicans have on the national election, they go hunting for a reformer, and they find then the current president of the Princeton University, Woodrow Wilson, and convince him to run for office as the governor of New Jersey, which he wins handily because he's quite famous and he's very, very well spoken. And like La Follette, like Roosevelt, he will go off and immediately begin to make changes. Now what's interesting, particularly when you look at Roosevelt and Wilson, is you can see if you study what they do as governor, you get a master class in the battle that I described to you between the progressives in a party and the old guard in a party. And there's a couple of wonderful, hilarious stories where both Roosevelt and then a decade later Wilson battle and win with the party boss who kind of ran things. In fact, the whole reason Roosevelt becomes the vice president in 1900 was because the party boss in New York wanted to get him the hell out of New York so we can take back control. He's doing all this reform crap. We make him the vice president. We all know the vice president's a useless job, as John Adams taught us. So we'll put him the vice president. And the day McKinley is inaugurated, he's saying to his friends, look at Teddy, I did it. And one of his friends said, be careful, he's only one assassin's bullet away. And it turned out, unfortunately for Mr. McKinley. And then, of course, the party boss in New York and all the party bosses for Republicans were more horrified, as I'm about to show you in the process. Just stay in here. What is the progressive thing? Direct elections. They decided, look, we've got to take direct election to senators. I told you earlier, and there's a longer conversation here which I won't go into, but the founders' view was the people voted for the representatives, but the states dealt with the senators. In the founders and Madison and the early concept of our Constitution, the senators were akin to being an ambassador. We have an ambassador in France, we have an ambassador in Germany. What do? They speak for you and me, theoretically, in consultation with the president, and we would say, the State Department, the Foreign Department, all that. But they're us, that one dude. And so the founders would say, well, who's Florida in D.C., who's up there? We're going to get 2 ambassadors, senators, so that people aren't going to have direct control. Now, there's a whole magic in what Madison did. He actually gave more control to the people, but it was through an indirect method, which if you're in the group saying democracy is holy and just and the cleansing agent, the only way to go, then indirect is not good. To me, the senator decision is one of the best test case for the populist idea of, is more democracy better? Then I would just argue, did it make a difference? It did not make a difference at all. And in fact, it's far worse than it was, particularly if you just look at tenure of time. And at that point in the early 20th century, the average senator was in office, I think it's something like 11 years, maybe 10 and a half years. Because they were never controlled by the election, they were controlled by the state legislature. So the legislature wanted to pull them back, they could pull them back without any questions. You are no longer the senator, come home. And often that would happen because parties changed, the House and the state changed hands. So they would get rid of the 2 senators who were obviously with that other party and put in 2 new senators. The last time I checked, the average tenure of senators was like something like 29 years. So we basically have senators for life. Well, they're working lives, which is the Roman version. The Senate for Rome was senator for life. And our founders thought that was a horrible idea. The nominating thing, we do it first. We're the first to allow direct primary nominations. And again, back to what happened with William Jennings Bryan, it's this idea of that the party bosses decide at the convention, and the progressives were like, no, it shouldn't happen that way. And so we should have a more direct way of doing it through direct elections. They also began to introduce the idea of voting in secret. You and I know, because this is all we've ever known. You walk upstairs, you can't even take your kid with you unless you have a reason, and there's other issues. You have to go in by yourself, which that's laudable, you kind of get it. But the point is that nobody can watch what you do. And if you go back and study elections prior to this, particularly in the South, there was a ton of social pressure because you'd have whole gangs of people standing there. And basically, I know where you live. Make sure you vote properly. And that happened really across the board, but in particular in the South, it was a big deal. But it happened in lots of places. So like, that's not right. We should make the direct election cleaner. We do that by having a lot more democracy, and how we're cleaning up the democracy. We do it this way. There's more different things that occur. These are not nationwide issues. These are more local, and there are certain states that this is not the way they do it. But these different examples are things that develop in the early 20th century as ways, again, to have more democracy, which is more citizen control in the way that they're thinking about it. Across the board, all these are running headlong into the fact that we're not a democracy, we're a republic. So lots of consternation because they didn't do what they probably should have done at the time, which was demand an entirely new constitution. But that's a different conversation. They go after corruption in the cities. City of Winter Park is managed by a city manager. He's supposedly an expert who knows a lot of things, and he has a team who does a lot of things, and they're not electable by you and me if you live in the city. You elect some commissioners, but you don't have anything to do with who's running the actual city, because the manager does that. He's a businessman, and it was designed to kind of cut corruption. The other alternative was a city commission plan. And again, you're trying to cut out the legs underneath the city bosses who can have all kinds of ways to gain influence and control. So you cut them out. You don't let them have that by having these people that people could elect directly, or you choose somebody you put on the payroll to manage the city. And again, all this is attacking these different things. All this is part of progressivism. If you dig into the different professions like medical and legal, again, this is the moment when lots of changes take place. And go back to the list I gave you. I won't go back in the slides, it'll take us too long. What is progressivism? Well, one aspect of it is you have experts and you have systems in place. So we don't want just random people being lawyers. Now there's going to be a system in place. They got to go through a school. We don't want just anybody being a doctor. The whole idea of the town doctor who probably spent 10 years working as an intern under the old town doctor, which worked out good enough. Nope. We got to have a system in place. So this idea, education begins to become more professional. This is when kindergarten's going to be introduced. High school is going to be extended to 12th grade at this point. All this idea, because what do we need? We need more education. More education will be a benefit to the society that we're trying to clean up in the process. It impacts our foreign policy. I will not say any more on this other than just let you look at the slide. But when you try to understand what you could call American imperialism, that's not really an accurate phrase, but if you look at the American foreign policy from, say, 1890 to current day, and you say, why do we got to be everywhere doing everything? The short answer is progressivism. Because there are poor people without any power who are less fortunate, who don't have any ability, and they don't know what to do. But we do, so we should go do it for them. Now, there's a whole raft of questions, which hopefully your brain is immediately saying, I have a problem with that. We're having some challenges with that, but that when you look at it, you want to understand what happened in Hawaii or Puerto Rico or the Philippines. The short answer of what happened is progressivism, because progressivism became everything in the country. The progressive presidents, there'll be a series of presidents, we're almost done, that are elected. Once Teddy, so McKinley's not progressive, to be very clear, but once Teddy takes over in 1901, all the way through 1920 with Woodrow Wilson, you'll have a 19-year run of progressive presidents. If there was a progressive party, you could say the progressive party controlled the White House, because what they do is progressive stuff. And when you study their presidencies, you see a consistent drumbeat of activities that would be natural for the populace to cheer and champion, and for any good progressive to say, yes, that is beneficial. Well, again, what are we trying to do? We're trying to fix the problems of the society that we find ourselves post-Civil War. Does that make sense? So just real quick to kind of run through, because I want to make sure we have time for some questions. I love Teddy Roosevelt, so I would say he does the best job. He does the most things. That's not quite fair to Wilson, who obviously finds most of his term compromised by the war, and Taft only got 4 years. But you can see this long list of things, and again, if you just go back in your mind to what was the populist platform, and what were they saying the enemies were? So industrialists are the enemies. So he's going to create a Department of Commerce and Labor, right? We're going to go after the railroad. The people are getting kind of crapped on. He's going to defend the workers in the union. Up to this point, anytime the government rolled out troops regarding a labor strike, it was to protect the business owners used against the people. Roosevelt calls the business owners of his mines into his office, and they basically laugh at him and walk out. And he's like, I'll show you. And he rolls out the National Guard to defend the workers. So it's kind of a shocking move. He gets his, and then this shows you the popularity. He won overwhelmingly. There were tons of Democrats who voted for him because he's doing, again, progressive Democrats. He's doing what we're wanting to see changed in the country. And of course, this isn't really even on the list relative connected to his role with the national parks, which isn't technically progressive, at least not from where the populists were. But if you remind yourself, the populists were these farmers, these Westerners. You can see Roosevelt doing that as a way of honoring the West, and, if you're an industrialist, limiting my ability to do what I want to do with my land. There's oil on that land. Well, we don't want you to tear it up because it's beautiful. So again, you can see him kind of taking that fight. He steps down as he promised he would. He regretted it until the day he died. And Taft is chosen. Now, Taft is not TR, and it's important to note that he's not TR. But so the question, is he a progressive? The short answer is yes, he's absolutely a progressive, because he will continue to do the things that Roosevelt did. Taft is not bombastic. Taft is a judicial mind. He's the only person ever elected to the presidency and chosen to be on the Supreme Court. He was chosen to be on the Supreme Court after his presidency. And so he really did not want to be the president. His wife wanted to be the president. She would probably have been an amazing elected official. She was a very sharp-minded woman. And of course, at that point, she was obviously, unfortunately, denied that access. So she would tell you her childhood dream was to be the first lady, because she knew that was as close as she could get. And she pulled it off. And he was miserable for his 4 years. But he was a progressive. And he supported progressive stuff. He did more antitrust suits. Where's it at? He did more antitrust suits than TR did. Right? So he was a progressive. He was pushing. He wanted this to happen. He just didn't want there to be conflict about it. And under his presidency, the old guard did get more strength, which is why they opposed TR when he tried to run again and be allowed to run in 1912. And of course, the fact the Republicans split their vote in 1912 is what opened the door for Woodrow Wilson to become the president. Wilson won with something like 40% of the vote. Andrew Jackson had about the same amount when he lost, even though he had the most votes, kind of a thing. But even though Wilson was hampered by the war, he still goes after a whole host of changes and kind of moving forward in ways that the progressives were happy. That this is what we want to see happen. These are changes we need to change. Now, I want to make sure it's really clear to you guys, because I've already told you, I don't like the fact that we've made democracy a synonym for republic. And so then there's a sense in which you might think, does Carl not like democracy? And if you said that relative to a political system, I would say, yes, I don't like it. I agree with Madison. I find it troubling. But that's not to say these changes that were made were either unwarranted or somehow an excess use of political power. I'm not saying that. So it's a little bit of I need you to see the nuance between the conversation about more democracy and the conversation about what the populists and the progressives were trying to pull off, or the problems that they saw. Because there were things that were going on. And this will be the period where we will make the most constitutional changes after the Bill of Rights. As the Civil War unfolds, we have the 13, 14, 15 in that time period. Here you have the 4. And to just kind of point out again this thing about progressivism, many of you might quickly leap your eyes to the 18th Amendment and think, well, what's that got to do? Why is that up there? Because when you ask people like Jane Addams and you ask other, particularly women leaders, what are we trying to do? Solve the problems of society. One of the problems of society are deadbeat dads who are abandoning their families. Another problem of society, mostly for men, was alcoholism. And you ask Jane Addams and many of the women leaders, how can we fix this? Their idea was eliminate alcohol. It's a very logical conclusion. Turns out it's very difficult to make happen in a sense of a governing system. But how did they want it to happen? We want the government, who we now control the giant of the land, to go out there and make this thing happen to make the world a better place by eliminating alcohol, at least in our country. Does that make sense? Now again, it didn't work out, and of course we repeal it in a later amendment, but it's important to see progressive, the idea of the kind of alcohol thing as a key example of progressive. And you can imagine there were a lot of progressives who were gung-ho for a lot of different things, and they thought that was a terrible idea. right? So again, you can be progressive and yet not support all the different ideas. Let me wrap it up. Wilson becomes the one who really ties us back into this word. It's Wilson who will first begin to use in his speeches the idea of democracy, capital D, proper noun. He'll be the ones he'll talk about this in his foreign policy work in World War I, of making it kind of, we should make the rest of the world a democracy. If there's more democracy, good will happen. If the world is governed by democracies, there'll be no war. 100 years later, we know he's wrong, just like they were wrong about the senators, because that's not true. But regardless, that's the viewpoint. Wilson kind of takes us there. In the 1920s, there is a small rebellion against the progressive impulse out of the 1912 election. And you can see that in who gets chosen. But of course, we're going to run right into the Great Depression, which brings us to FDR. And then FDR not only uses democracy as a way and using more government agency and action to combat the Depression. Again, think back to Coxey's Army and the response of the reformer president Grover Cleveland in the 1890s. In his response, no, government shouldn't do anything. Hoover gets dumped on all the time, unfairly I might add, about his response. But his response was in keeping to both A, the founders' view, do we have government do a lot of stuff, and his own personal view of kind of self-made person, right? You kind of lift yourself up by your bootstraps, right? But even Hoover will reverse trend once it's really clear by late 31, this thing's really bad. And he will reverse trend and start doing all the same things FDR does. FDR just does more of them. But then you bring the war into it, and once you get the war and you get this idea of the arsenal of democracy, it's really locked in. And so from this moment, democracy is a synonym and the preferred description of the country compared to republic. And I think that's pretty much where we should stop. Yeah. Yeah, you can see the kind of progressivism kind of works its way in, but it's, again, this idea that democracy is the cleansing agent to allow us to have government do more things for us. And that's kind of, we kind of work our way there. When you say, back to the first question, are we a democracy? And the answer should be no, but 90 to 98% of the population thinks we are. The how is the populist. First to really raise this question. Their ideas spreading out through the progressives, and then you put the three presidents together. 1912 election is probably one of the most important, if not, well, certainly in the top 5 of most important elections because of its legacy when the majority of the country votes progressive. And that becomes the dominant viewpoint of us. And we saw it recently in the 2007, 8, 9 economic crisis. Very few people somehow said, no, let's let it work its way out. Like they would have said in 1870. Or they at least would have said, it's not the government's job to do anything. You'll just make it worse. People are like, no, they need to do stuff. We expect them to do things. I'm not saying right or wrong to that point, to just point out that you can see how we changed in that viewpoint. And I'll stop there, kind of working our way to this point. Do you have any questions that you'd like to ask? Which part? You guys are great. I appreciate coming here. I want to pause for a second. Are there any? Nope. Everybody's good. Everybody got your questions answered? Yes, sir.
Get from a fire hydrant to get all this information.
It is absolutely. I wish there was. Well, we could go back to the 4-hour session. Yeah. The populists are the most important group. Go find some books here in the library about the Populist Party. Though you'll be hard pressed because they're usually the story is the progressive did this for us, and obviously the various progressives and the progressive movement does do a lot of things for us. I just make the contention that it's the populists who jumpstart us. Yes, ma'am.
Did anybody else, I can't remember the exact quote, but Nancy Pelosi was caught on video complaining about the populists just recently.
Uh-huh.
So I just wondered if anybody else.
Well, I would just say that Populist Party and populism are two separate things, but there is a linkage. And the linkage, it's kind of funny to think most of the political people who are afraid of populism today would technically be progressives in general, how they act out, and that's both political parties, and I can make that argument with evidence. And yet, where are they? They sit in the seat of power, so what are they afraid of? the people. So the whole point of the Populist Party's complaint was the current political leadership is not helping us. Now, to make my point about democracy, I would say, well, we've been doing it your way with democracy as supposedly a cleansing agent for now 140 years. It clearly doesn't work like you think. So let's back away from that word and start asking the other questions. Again, back on that rocket ship to Mars. Well, how would I want to structure a government that does still represent and reflect the idea of an of the people government, and yet doesn't pick up a mantle of something that has historically proven to be unwieldy, or even, as Madison said, dangerous to people? You don't have to agree with Madison, but just saying that's his position, that democracies are dangerous, ever spectacles of turbulence. Which, if you pay attention just in the past 15 years, that's all you can see our country's become, a spectacle of turbulence. And I would offer that a piece of that is because we have this misguided belief that we're in a democracy. And then that leads us to expectations and assumptions that are incorrect on their face if you know we're not a democracy. Yes, sir?
Okay, you made a comment that the last presidents for the last century have all been progressives except one. I'm feeling a little thick today. I don't know who that is.
It's hidden, and it's arguably that I'm wrong. But Ronald Reagan's the only person to run for office and openly take a stance against progressive thought. The argument could be made, certainly in his second term, that he governed like a progressive. Because again, if you think in the bigger structure, he cut some taxes, but he didn't cut all the taxes. He cut some government spending, but he didn't cut all the government spending. And again, a non-progressive would cut all government spending. It'd be Jefferson. We're cutting all the spending. But he's the only one. So when Coolidge and Harding and Hoover run in the 20s, they're the other three. Somebody could say, well, they are not progressives, and that could be fair. But in the way I tell the story, I guess I gloss over them, perhaps it's just my error. He's the only one to openly run saying, I am not a progressive, and I'm coming after progressive tenets. And he did largely, in his first term, make moves in that direction. And the fact that he was able to win. Now, the idea, I should show you this slide. The idea you do see some opposition to progressivism building in the 60s, but really Reagan's the first one to kind of go there openly and say, I'm against. And then that movement, not to get us off on another track, but that movement was not sustained by the Republicans because they elected a moderate progressive in George Herbert Walker Bush. He was not a non-progressive like Reagan, which, if you remember in the 80 elections, why he's on the ticket is Reagan wanted to kind of balance his own hard side with this soft progressive Republican side. So back to who's in the circle for the Republicans, progressives and non-progressives. But then they didn't jettison him to pick another equivalent to Reagan. And to me, I know this would be controversial for some, Clinton, Bush, that's the same president. We had the same dude in office for 20 years. They differed in a few spots here and there, but largely they're the same guy, and they were all progressive. And what Mr. Obama ran against was to be more progressive. So he moved further down because it wasn't being progressive enough. But notice he was not saying, you're not progressive. Mr. Obama's whole election, hope and change. Change what? We're going to change and become more progressive, but not in a against conservatism or non-progressivism, because there wasn't anybody like that. And I'll leave Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden alone, but I think you could arguably say they're similar. Again, remember, progressive, I can be progressive and not agree with these tenets over here, but I agree with these tenets over here. And because it's a movement, I can pull that off. And they have it. One more. Yes, ma'am.
You were talking about how the Klan forced everyone in the South to vote Democrat.
Yes,
At
ma'am.
some point, they kind of flipped overnight, and they called themselves Republicans instead.
It's not overnight. It's about a 30-year window. We covered that when we did a study on political parties. If you come talk to me afterwards, I'll show you how to get to that video so you can show where I explain that. But yeah, and that's a part of this thing in the 60s. We, unfortunately, well, maybe it's fortunate because I think it helps bring it to our face, which I think this is valuable. And I'll stop with this, make sure I can say it well. We have still not fully confronted what when Marcellus calls our national, not ill, but it's the part of the story Marcellus says, a jazz trumpetist, amazing educator, look him up, that is our ill. It's our weakness. It's our cross to bear. It's our challenge we need to solve in our civil interaction relationships with various groups of peoples, of culture. And ours is, because of our history, mostly a black-white thing. And many of us feel like that has still not adequately been confronted. And so because it hasn't been confronted, and because the failure of Reconstruction, my way of looking at it, allowing, so we were doing cancer, and if you ever know who's tragically dealt with cancer, you want the doctors to get all of it. And if they can't get all of it, then it grows. And from Carl's perspective, we still have not really confronted that and done the necessary work to eliminate it. We're making progress, in my opinion. So, you guys are great. Thank you so much. Make sure you tell everybody else we live in a republic, not a democracy. See ya.